close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your gaze go soft, resting on nothing in particular. Let your body settle wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open and still. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing to hold on to. For the next little while, you are simply here, listening and resting. Tonight, we are going somewhere warm and unhurried, somewhere in the Japanese countryside, in the kind of place where the rice fields stretch wide and flat beneath an open sky, and the roads between the villages are long and dusty, and the world moves at the pace of things that grow rather than the pace of things that are built. It is a place where a journey can begin with almost nothing, with a single piece of straw picked up from the ground without thinking, held loosely in one hand, as a young man walks out into the world, not quite knowing where he is going or what will come of it. This is a story about that young man. It is a quiet story, a slow one, the kind where nothing is forced and everything arrives in its own time, carried along by the simple current of one honest exchange after another. Breathe in slowly and let it out. Let the day go. There is nowhere else to be. There are people in every village and every town and every part of Japan who are known for their good nature, the way other people are known for their skill with a particular craft or their knowledge of a particular subject, known for it the way the landscape is known for a particular feature, a particular hill, or a particular bend in the river, something that is simply there and has always been there and is part of what the place is. The young man in this story was known in that way. He was known for his willingness, for the quality of attention he brought to whatever was in front of him, for the absence in him of the calculation and guardedness that many people develop as they make their way through a world that does not always treat them well. He was not naive. He had lived long enough and worked hard enough to understand that the world was not arranged for his convenience, and that things did not generally come easily. But he had not let that understanding harden into bitterness or close him off from what was around him, and that quality, that openness, that willingness to be present to whatever the day offered, was the thing that people noticed about him and remembered. He had no family left to speak of. His parents were gone, and he had no brothers or sisters, and the relatives who remained were distant enough in both blood and geography that they had little to do with his life. He had no land of his own, no house, no trade that could feed him reliably through the changing of the seasons. He worked where work was available, in the rice fields at planting time and harvest time, in the forests cutting wood when the season permitted, carrying loads and mending things and doing whatever needed doing for whoever needed it done. It was not a bad life, exactly, but it was a life without much purchase, without the feeling of solidity and continuance that comes from having a place that is yours, and a work that is yours, and a future that you can see the shape of, even if you cannot see its details. And on the morning that this story begins, the young man had walked a long distance, with not much money, and not much food, and not much sense of where he was going, and he was tired in the way that people get tired, not just from walking, but from the accumulated weight of not quite knowing what their life is for. His feet carried him in the way that feet sometimes carry people when the mind has stopped directing them to a temple on the edge of a small town. It was not a grand temple, not one of the great complexes of halls and gates and pagodas that stand in the famous places and draw visitors from far away. It was the kind of temple that exists in every part of Japan, modest and local, its buildings weathered by many seasons, its courtyard swept clean by the monk or caretaker whose daily task that was, its air holding the particular quality of temple air that is different from the air outside, stiller, somehow, as if the space inside the walls had agreed to move at a different pace from the space outside them. The main hall of the temple housed a statue of Kannon, the bodhisattva of compassion, the figure to whom people bring the things they cannot bring anywhere else, the griefs and the worries and the hopes that are too large or too formless to be addressed to any ordinary person. Kannon is depicted in many forms in Japan, sometimes standing, sometimes seated, sometimes with many arms that reach in all directions simultaneously, as if to indicate that compassion has no limit on the directions in which it can extend. This particular Kannon was seated, of medium size, its expression the expression of someone who has heard everything, and is not troubled by any of it, and is still listening. The young man climbed the worn stone steps and stood before the hall and pressed his hands together and bowed his head. He did not have an elaborate prayer prepared. He was not a particularly religious person in the formal sense. He did not observe all the rituals or know all the sutras or participate in all the ceremonies that a more devout person would have participated in, but he was sincere, and sincerity is what temples of this kind ask for. He asked simply for some guidance, some indication of which direction to go, some small sign that the world was paying attention. He stayed there a long time, head bowed, hands pressed together, while the sounds of the town continued on the other side of the temple wall, the voices of people going about their morning, the sound of a cart on a stone road, the cry of a bird somewhere above the rooftops, and the courtyard remained still. And then, in the way that answers sometimes come, not as a voice or a vision or anything that could be pointed to and described precisely, but as a kind of settling, a quieting of something that had been restless, a sense of knowing, arriving from somewhere beneath the level of ordinary thought. The young man understood that he should take whatever he first touched upon leaving the temple and carry it with him and let it lead him where it would. It was not a complicated instruction. It was not a promise of wealth or success or any particular outcome. It was simply, take what comes first to your hand and trust it. He rose slowly. He turned and walked back across the courtyard and down the worn stone steps toward the gate. And on the last step, his foot caught the edge of the stone, and he stumbled forward, his hands going out automatically to catch himself, and his fingers closed around something lying in the dust at the base of the steps. He looked down. It was a single piece of straw, one of the stalks of dried rice straw that were everywhere in this part of Japan, blown from the fields after the harvest, carried by the wind into corners and against walls and onto the roads, so common as to be essentially invisible, the kind of thing a person steps over without registering. He stayed crouched there for a moment, looking at it in his hand. A single piece of straw, dry and pale and slightly bent, about the length of his hand from wrist to fingertip, not remarkable in any way that a piece of straw can be remarkable. He thought about this for a moment. He could have felt disappointed. He could have told himself that the instruction had been his imagination, and the stumble an ordinary stumble, and the straw an ordinary piece of straw, and none of it meant anything. But he didn't. He smiled instead, a small, quiet smile, the kind that is more like a decision than an expression, and he tucked the straw carefully into his hand, and stood up and walked out through the temple gate and onto the road. The road outside the temple ran south through the town, and then out into the countryside, where the buildings thinned and gave way to the rice fields that were the main fact of the landscape in this part of Japan. The fields in this season, late spring, the planting recently done, were filled with young rice plants standing in shallow water, their green vivid against the brown of the earth below, the whole landscape flooded and reflective, the sky doubled in the water between the rows. The road ran along the edge of this landscape on a raised embankment, wide enough for a cart, with the fields on either side and the mountains visible in the distance on clear days, and obscured by haze on days like this one, present but unspecific, shapes rather than details. The young man walked slowly, the piece of straw held loosely between his fingers. He was not in a hurry. He had nowhere specific to be and nothing specific to do, and for the moment that felt less like poverty and more like freedom, the freedom of a person who has let go of one thing and has not yet picked up another, who is in the interval between, which is uncomfortable in some ways and spacious in others. He looked at the fields as he walked. He noticed the way the light moved on the water between the rice plants, the small movements of insects above the surface, the distant figure of another farmer working at the far edge of a field, bent at the waist in the posture of someone doing the slow, patient work of tending something that grows. He noticed the smell of the fields, the particular smell of flooded rice paddies in warm weather, which is the smell of water and earth and something living, a rich, slightly vegetal smell that is not unpleasant, and that is one of the essential smells of the Japanese countryside in the growing season, familiar to everyone who has ever lived near rice fields, and immediately recognizable to anyone who has grown up with it. He had not walked far when a horsefly appeared. It came from the direction of the fields. They bred in the wet margins of the paddies. These flies, large and purposeful, and possessed of the particular persistence that makes them, to the people and animals who share the summer landscape with them, one of the less welcome features of the season. This one circled the young man's head once, then again, with the unhurried confidence of something that has decided it is interested and sees no reason to hide the fact. The young man waved it away. It returned. He waved it away again, more deliberately. It circled out and came back, its low droning hum steady and untroubled, like the sound of something that has a great deal of patience and intends to use it. He watched it for a moment, the way it moved, the way it held its position in the air despite the movement of the air around it, the way its wings caught the light when it turned, and then, on an impulse he could not have explained, he reached out and caught it, not to kill it. He closed his fingers gently, carefully, just enough to hold it without harming it, feeling the small, strong vibration of its wings against his palm. He looked at it for a moment through the gap in his fingers. Then he took the piece of straw and, with the careful attention of someone doing a small, precise thing, tied one end of it loosely around the fly's leg. He held the other end of the straw and opened his hand. The fly lifted immediately, pulling against the straw, rising to the length of the tether and then circling, pulling, circling, the straw trailing from it like the string of a very small kite, the fly's hum taking on a slightly indignant quality, as if it understood that something had changed in its situation and was not entirely pleased about it. The young man laughed, a short, surprise sound, the kind of laugh that happens before you have decided whether something is funny. He kept walking, the straw trailing out from his fingers, the fly pulling at the end of it. After a while, the road passed through a small settlement, not quite a village, just a cluster of houses and a well and a rest area, where travelers could stop and sit in the shade of a large zelkova tree, whose roots had lifted the stones of the road around it, in the patient way that large old trees lift the things that were laid around them before anyone understood how large they would become. At the rest area, there was a family, a man and a woman and a young child, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, with a small cart that held their belongings. They had the look of people who had been traveling for some time and had stopped not entirely by choice. The cart had a wheel sitting at a slightly wrong angle, and the man was crouched beside it with the focused expression of someone trying to determine whether a problem is serious or merely inconvenient. The child was in the cart, and the child was crying, not the sharp, urgent crying of pain or fear, but the heavy, persistent crying of a child who is tired and hot, and has been in a cart for too long, and has run out of patience with the whole situation. The young man slowed. He watched the child for a moment. Then he held out his hand and let the horsefly on its straw tether drift forward in the air, the fly circling in its small, patient orbit, the straw trailing, the whole arrangement catching what little breeze there was, and moving with it. The child went still. The crying stopped between one moment and the next, replaced by the complete focused silence of a very young child who has seen something that has claimed all of its attention. The child's eyes tracked the fly. A small hand reached out. The fly circled, and the child's face opened into the kind of joy that only very young children produce. Total, immediate, filling the whole face at once, nothing held back, no awareness of being watched. The woman looked up. She and the young man looked at each other for a moment over the child's head, and she said that her child had been crying since before the last town, and she had not been able to find anything that helped, and she asked, with the careful politeness of someone asking for more than feels entirely proper, whether he might be willing to part with his curious little toy. The young man held the tether out, without hesitation. She took it with both hands in a deep bow, and tied it carefully around her own wrist, so that the fly continued its orbit in front of the child, who watched it with an expression of complete satisfaction. Then she reached into the cart and brought out 3 mandarin oranges, mikan, the small sweet tangerines that in Japan are so thoroughly associated with winter warmth and rest, that the smell of them alone can conjure the feeling of sitting beside a low table with a warm blanket over your lap. They were ripe and slightly warm from sitting in the cart in the sun, and they smelled of the clean sweetness that mandarin skin has when it is pressed or broken. He thanked her. She thanked him. The child did not look up from the fly. He walked on, 3 oranges in his hands, the road continuing south through the fields. The 3 oranges were a different kind of thing to carry than a piece of straw. They had weight and substance and smell, and carrying them required a small amount of care. They were ripe enough that pressing them too hard would damage them, and the young man carried them in both hands for a while, then found a way to hold all 3 in the fold of his arm, so that his hands were free. He thought about eating one. The morning had been long, and he had not eaten much, and the oranges smelled good, and the day was warm, and it would have been entirely reasonable. But something, not a voice, not a prohibition, just a quiet sense of waiting, of these things being for something he had not yet arrived at, made him keep walking with the oranges still unpeeled. The road in the early afternoon passed through a stretch of country where the rice fields gave way briefly to drier land, slightly elevated, with groves of cedar and bamboo on the hillsides, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road behind its windbreak of trees. It was quieter here than in the open fields. The trees absorbed the sounds from the road, and the wind moved in them with the particular sound of wind in bamboo, a dry, rattling whisper that is one of the most distinctly Japanese of sounds, heard in gardens and in temple grounds, and in the margins of the countryside wherever bamboo has been planted or has spread on its own. He came to a place where a woman was sitting at the edge of the road in the shade of a bamboo grove, beside a bundle of belongings that suggested she was traveling rather than simply resting. She was not well. Even from a distance he could see that in the quality of the stillness she was sitting in, which was the stillness of someone who has stopped, not because they wanted to stop, but because stopping was required. As he approached, he could see that her face was pale, and that she was pressing one hand against her side, and that her breathing was careful, in the way that breathing becomes careful when something hurts. An older woman, her companion, or perhaps her mother, was kneeling beside her, with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to show how worried they are. The young man stopped. He asked if he could help. The older woman looked up and said that her companion had been unwell since early morning, and that the heat of the road had made it worse, and that what she needed most urgently was something with juice and sweetness. The young man held out all 3 oranges without deliberation. The older woman received them with both hands and bowed deeply, and peeled one immediately and offered the sections to the young woman one at a time, and the young woman ate them slowly, and the young man stood a little apart and waited and watched the quality of the sitting change slightly, a small easing visible even from where he stood. When the orange was finished, the older woman rose and went to the bundle of belongings, and unwrapped the outer layer carefully, and drew out a length of silk. It was pale, the color of unbleached paper, with a fine weave and a quiet sheen that shifted as she moved it. Silk in Japan has a long history of being the material of ceremony and significance, the silk that wraps the gifts given at important occasions, the silk of the formal kimono worn at the moments in a life that are worth marking, the silk that lines the lacquered boxes in which the important objects of a household are kept. This length of silk was not large, but it was fine, and the woman offered it with the gravity of someone offering something that mattered. He accepted it with both hands and a bow. He folded it carefully and tucked it inside his jacket, where it lay cool and smooth against the coarser fabric, and bowed once more and turned back to the road. The afternoon was long and the road was quiet, and the young man walked at the unhurried pace of someone who has stopped trying to arrive somewhere and is simply moving through the world, paying attention to it. He noticed the way the light lay across the landscape in the middle of the afternoon, flat and golden, the kind of light that has given up the sharpness of morning and not yet taken on the warmth of evening, the kind of light that makes everything look exactly as it is, without drama or embellishment. He noticed the sound of water moving in the irrigation channels that ran alongside the road, the low, continuous murmur that had been accompanying him for most of the day, so constant that he had stopped hearing it and now heard it again, in the way you rehear things that have always been there. He noticed the smell of the road itself, the warm dust of the dry stretches, the cooler damp smell of the places where water came close to the surface, the occasional sweetness of something flowering in the verge. The rice paddies in this part of the road had given way to wider fields, dryland fields where other crops grew, barley and soybeans in their rows, and there were farmhouses more frequently here, set closer to the road, with their storage buildings and their kitchen gardens behind their low walls. The paddies required flooding and so were laid out in relation to the water, wherever the water could be brought from the irrigation system, but the dryland fields could go anywhere the soil was good, and the farmer could reach them, and so the landscape here had a different character, less regular, less repetitive, more varied in its shapes and its levels, a landscape that had been fitted around the specificities of the land rather than imposed upon it. He was passing a paddock at the edge of the road, a fenced area of rough grass where a few animals could be kept, when he heard a sound that was wrong. It was the sound of a large animal breathing with difficulty, slow and labored, each breath a visible effort, the kind of breathing that is working much harder than breathing should have to work. He stopped. He looked over the fence. A horse was lying on its side in the grass, a dark horse, well proportioned, with the long legs and the depth of chest that indicated good breeding, the kind of horse that in better circumstances would have been moving through the world with ease and confidence. It was lying very still except for the difficult movement of its ribs and its eyes. When the young man leaned over the fence to look, were open and glazed and very tired, with the particular quality of exhaustion that is close to something worse. A man came out from the shed at the far side of the paddock. He was a merchant of some kind. His clothing and his manner both suggested someone who moved between towns and dealt in goods, the kind of person who calculated value quickly and accurately and made decisions based on those calculations. He explained that the horse had collapsed that morning, that he had tried everything he knew to try, and that he needed to be in the next town before nightfall, and could not wait any longer. He said this with the expression of a person who has made a decision they are not entirely comfortable with, and is explaining it more to himself than to the person he is talking to. He looked at the horse the way people look at things they are trying to detach themselves from. The young man looked at the horse for a long time. He thought about the silk inside his jacket, the fine pale silk that had been given to him with gravity and care, that was worth considerably more than a sick horse lying in a paddock that might not recover. He thought about the instruction he had received at the temple, which was not to calculate but to follow, not to protect what he had, but to let it lead him. He drew the silk from inside his jacket and held it out. He said he would take the horse and tend to it and see what could be done. The merchant looked at the silk. He looked at the young man. He looked at the horse. Then he took the silk with both hands and a short bow and walked away quickly in the direction of the road without looking back. The young man climbed the fence and crossed the paddock and sat down in the grass beside the horse. He did not try to lift it or move it or do anything that required it to exert itself. He simply sat beside it in the late afternoon light and kept it company in the way that it is possible to keep company with something large and suffering, not with words, which would mean nothing to a horse, and not with busy intervention, which would only add to the disturbance, but with presence, with the quiet, steady presence of another creature nearby, which animals can feel and which is not nothing. He found the water trough at the far edge of the paddock and brought water in his cupped hands, again and again, kneeling beside the horse's head, offering it patiently. The horse drank slowly, without eagerness at first, but steadily, and the young man made the trip to the trough and back many times as the afternoon moved toward evening. He talked to the horse quietly as he worked, not saying anything in particular, just talking in the low, even tone that horses respond to, the tone that says, "I am here. I am not a threat. I am not going anywhere." As the sun dropped toward the hills to the west, the horse's breathing became easier. The glazed quality left its eyes, and it began to track the young man's movements with more attention. By the time the light had gone horizontal and golden, across the paddock the horse had lifted its head from the grass and held it up, which required effort but was clearly possible, and which was different from how things had been an hour before. By the time the first stars appeared, it had gathered itself and risen to its feet, slowly, with effort, one leg at a time, pausing between each effort to find its balance, and stood in the dimming paddock with its legs slightly spread and its head still low, but standing. The young man stood beside it and rested his hand on its neck and felt the warmth of it and the steadiness of its breathing, which was no longer labored but simply the breathing of a large animal at rest. The night came down over the paddock the way night comes down in the countryside, gradually, without announcement, the light diminishing by degrees until the sky was fully dark and the stars were fully out, and the fields around the paddock were shapes rather than details. The young man sat with his back against the fence post and looked at the stars for a while, and then let his eyes close. The horse stood nearby in the darkness, breathing steadily, and the night moved over them both, unhurried, and the whole dark countryside settled into its deep, familiar quiet. In the morning, the horse was well, not entirely well. It still moved with deliberateness, still held its head slightly lower than a horse holds its head when it is entirely comfortable, but well enough to walk, and well enough to follow the young man when he led it gently out through the paddock gate and onto the road. The young man did not ride it. He walked beside it, one hand resting occasionally on its neck, and the horse walked beside him in the way that a horse walks when it has decided to trust someone, close and attentive, its steps matching his without being asked. There had been rain in the night. The young man had slept through it, briefly woken by a sound of it on the shed roof, and then back asleep. And the world had the particular clarity that follows rain, everything washed and fresh and precise, the outlines of the mountains visible at the edges of the sky with an unusual sharpness, the colors of the fields and the verges vivid in the morning light. The road was damp and the dust was laid, and the grasses along the road were heavy with water and bent by it, and the air smelled of wet earth and whatever was flowering in the verges, and there were birds active and vocal in a way that birds are active and vocal in the morning after rain, as if the rain had refreshed something in them too. The young man walked slowly, the horse beside him, and felt, with a quietness that surprised him, that he was happy. Not the sharp, excited happiness of getting something you wanted, but the slower, steadier happiness of being in the right place in the right moment, of having done what needed to be done, and finding yourself, on the other side of it, in a world that seems slightly better than it did before. He had given away a piece of silk for a sick horse. The horse had recovered. He was walking down a beautiful road in the morning after rain with a horse beside him that had decided to trust him, and the mountains were sharp against the sky, and there was nowhere he urgently needed to be. This was enough. This was, in fact, quite a lot. By midday, the road had brought him to the edge of a wide valley, broader than the ones he had been walking through, with a river visible in the distance, and the town that had grown up around the river visible as a cluster of rooftops, and the occasional taller structure, a warehouse, a temple pagoda, rising above them. The road here was wider and better maintained than the road he had been on, worn smooth by more traffic, with the verges kept clear, and the bridges over the irrigation channels solid and recently repaired. This was a prosperous part of the country. He could see it in the quality of the farmhouses, in the size of the fields, in the straightness and regularity of the irrigation system, all of which spoke of resources applied carefully over a long time to the improvement of the land. At the edge of the road, set back behind a wall of old stone and a row of large pine trees, whose age was visible in the breadth of their trunks and the complexity of their branching, there was an estate. The gate was open, and there was activity in the courtyard, servants moving with the organized busyness of people who have clear tasks and are doing them, things being carried and arranged, the sound of voices giving and receiving instructions. The buildings of the estate were substantial and well maintained, their roofs newly thatched in places, their walls freshly whitewashed, the garden visible through the gate complex and carefully tended, the kind of garden that takes decades to achieve and requires constant attention to sustain. A man came out through the gate as the young man approached, the master of the estate clearly, from the way the others in the courtyard oriented toward him without stopping their work, the way people orient toward a center of gravity without having to think about it. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, and his eyes went immediately and with obvious recognition to the horse walking beside the young man. He came out through the gate and walked around the horse slowly, looking at it with the attentiveness of someone who knows horses and is accustomed to evaluating them carefully before reaching a conclusion. He ran a hand along its flank. He looked at its legs. He stood in front of it and looked at its face, and the horse looked back at him with its dark, calm eyes. Then the man turned to the young man and asked where he was going. The young man said, honestly, that he did not entirely know. He said that he had set out from a temple some days ago with a piece of straw, and that one thing had led to another in the way that things sometimes do when you stop trying to direct them, and that the horse had come to him sick, and he had stayed with it through the night, and that here he was. He told this simply, without dramatizing it, and without diminishing it, the way you tell the plain account of something when you have stopped trying to make it sound like more or less than it is. The master of the estate listened carefully. He was quiet for a moment after the young man finished, looking at the horse, and then at the young man, and then at the horse again. Then he said that he recognized this horse, that it had been bred on this estate, and sold some years ago when circumstances had required it, and that he had regretted the sale, and had not expected to see the horse again. He said that he would like to have it back. He asked what the young man wanted in exchange. The young man thought about this. He thought about the straw, and the fly, and the oranges, and the silk, and the horse, and the long road, and the rain in the night, and the sharp mountains in the morning, and the steadiness of the horse walking beside him. He thought about how none of it had been planned, how each thing had simply presented itself, and he had responded to it, and how the responding had led, without his intending it, to this, to standing in front of an open gate with a recovered horse beside him, being asked what he wanted. He looked at the estate, the old pines, the well-made buildings, the garden visible through the gate, the sense of a place that had been cared for over a long time by people who valued it. He said that he did not need much, but if there was work to be done on the estate, he would do it well, and if there was somewhere he could sleep, he would ask for nothing more than that. He said this without false modesty, not performing humility, but genuinely meaning it, genuinely having arrived at a point where shelter and useful work seemed like exactly what he wanted. The master of the estate looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, not a large smile, but a real one, the kind that comes from recognizing something you were hoping to find. He said that a person who had turned a piece of straw into a horse without deceiving or taking advantage of anyone along the way was a person he was glad to have arrived at his gate. He opened the gate wider and gestured toward the courtyard. The return. The young man led the horse through the gate. A stable hand came immediately and took the horse by the bridle, and the horse went with him calmly, turning its head once to look back at the young man before it disappeared into the stable. The young man watched it go. He felt something at that. A small thing, not grief, not quite, but the particular feeling of a connection that has been made and then released. of having been trusted by something and then letting it go to where it belonged. A servant led him across the courtyard and through a low doorway and along a covered walkway to a room at the back of the main building, a room that looked out through a sliding screen onto a small interior garden. The garden was the kind of garden that Japanese rooms have looked onto for centuries. A few carefully placed stones, a small pine tree grown and shaped over many years into a particular balanced asymmetry, a patch of moss between the stones, a stone basin with water, not large, not spectacular, but composed, arranged with the understanding that a garden seen through a screen is a different thing from a garden walked through, that what is needed is something to rest the eye on, something that holds stillness without holding rigidity, that changes with the light and the season while remaining itself. A sleeping mat had been laid out on the clean wooden floor, and there was a small low table and a ceramic cup of water, and through the screen the garden was quiet and still in the late afternoon light. The young man sat down on the mat. He looked at the garden for a while. He looked at the small pine, which had been growing in this garden for longer than he had been alive, patiently becoming the shape it was, with no awareness of being looked at and no need for it. He looked at the stones, which had been in their positions for as long as the garden had existed, holding the particular quality of very old stones that have been chosen for their shape and placed with care, the quality of things that are exactly where they are supposed to be. He lay down slowly on the mat. He closed his eyes. Outside, the courtyard went quiet as the afternoon deepened, and the estate settled into its evening rhythm, and the garden held its stillness. He stayed. That is the simple version of what happened next, and it is accurate as far as it goes. He stayed, and the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, and the months accumulated into seasons, and the seasons into years, and he stayed through all of it. He worked on the estate as he had said he would, and he worked well, which he had also said he would, and neither of these things surprised anyone who came to know him. He learned the fields and the rhythms of the estate, the particular qualities of the soil in different parts of the land, the places where the water ran well and the places where it needed help, the timing of the work through the year, the planting and the tending and the harvesting and the preparation for the next year, the whole long circular logic of an agricultural estate that has been operating for generations and has refined its practices through all the accumulated experience of everyone who has worked it. He was good at learning, not in the way that is merely clever. He was not particularly clever, in the narrow sense of that word, but in the way that comes from genuine attention, from actually looking at what is in front of you and listening to what the people who know more than you are telling you, and being willing to be wrong and to try again without making a great event of it. The people who worked on the estate recognized this quality in him and were over time willing to teach him things they might not have taught someone who was merely present and merely competent, things they might only teach someone they trusted. And the master of the estate watched this and was satisfied in the particular way that a person is satisfied when they trusted their initial judgment of someone and have been proven right. There was a daughter of the household. She was a few years younger than the young man, and she had grown up on this estate in the way that people grow up in places they belong to, knowing it deeply and specifically, knowing the name of every tree in the garden, and the history of every building, and the stories attached to every corner of the land. She was not waiting for someone to arrive and change her life. Her life was full and specific, and she was engaged with it. But she noticed the young man in the way that people notice others who have the quality of genuine attention, and she found herself, over the months and then the years, seeking out occasions to speak with him, and finding that the speaking was easy in the way that it is easy with people whose company agrees with you without your being able to say exactly why. They married in the end in the way that things happen in this story, without drama, without sudden revelation, without a moment where everything changed at once. There was a conversation, and then another, and then a ceremony in the garden on a morning in late spring, with the old pine tree standing as it had always stood, and the stones in their places, and the moss between them, the particular deep green that moss is in spring, and the people of the estate gathered in the courtyard, and the day was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that the important days of a life are both of those things simultaneously. And in time, as the master of the estate grew older, and the young man, who was no longer quite so young, grew more capable and more trusted, and more deeply rooted in the place, the estate passed to him, not in a single moment, not as a transaction, but gradually, the way responsibility passes, when it passes honestly, through the accumulation of demonstrated care, through the slow transfer of knowledge, through the recognition on both sides that the place had found the person it needed. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the work of the day was finished and the estate had settled into its evening quiet, and the light had gone low and golden over the garden, he would sit on the edge of the covered walkway with his feet on the stepping stone below, and look at the small pine and the old stones and the moss between them, and he would hold in his mind, lightly and without effort, the image of a piece of straw, dry and pale and slightly bent, lying in the dust at the base of a temple step, the kind of thing a person steps over without registering. He had picked it up. That was all. He had picked it up because he had been told to take the first thing that came to his hand, and it had come to his hand, and he had picked it up and held it and let it lead him. And somewhere along the long road that followed, through the fly and the child and the oranges and the silk and the horse and the morning after rain and the sharp mountains and the open gate, his life had become this garden, this place, this person beside him in the evenings, this work that was his, this land that knew him, this particular arrangement of stones and moss and pine that he had been looking at long enough now that it had become part of how he understood himself to be in the world. He had not planned any of it. He had not been clever about it, or strategic, or calculating. He had simply paid attention and responded honestly to what presented itself, and what had presented itself, in response to that honesty, was a life, a full one, a life that fit him the way a tool fits a hand that has used it long enough, not because the fit was perfect from the beginning, but because the use itself had made the fit, the daily contact between the person and the work and the place, shaping all three of them gradually into something that went together. He sat in the garden in the evening light and breathed slowly and felt, without needing to name it, the thing that is the opposite of the weariness he had felt on the road on the morning this story began, the thing that is not the absence of effort, but the presence of rightness, the sense of being exactly where you are supposed to be and knowing it. Let it all soften now, the long dusty road and the flooded rice fields reflecting the sky, the temple courtyard and the piece of straw in the dust, the fly on its tether and the child's face opening into joy, the sick horse breathing in the paddock and the night coming down over the countryside, the morning after rain and the sharp mountains and the open gate. Let it dissolve gently, the way the mist dissolves over the rice fields in the morning when the sun has been up long enough, burning off quietly, without drama, leaving the landscape clear. There is nothing left to hold tonight, nothing to figure out, nothing to carry. You are warm, and you are still, and you are exactly where you should be. The road is quiet. The fields are at rest. The garden holds its stillness in the evening light. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet take you. Let the day go completely, the way the young man let each thing go when the time came, without grasping, without regret, with the trust that what comes next will be what it needs to be. Rest well. Sleep well. Good night.